The needle touched her hide, and she didn't flinch. I've put ink into a lot of things I wasn't supposed to. Prison-grade hand poke into my own calf at 16, a wobbly compass rose that never pointed anywhere useful, a drunk friend's shoulder on a dare in university, 3 tour deployments where I kept a kid in my pack because there was always someone who needed something permanent after a day that felt too impermanent. The needle going in, the held breath, the slow release, it was always the same. That moment right before the mark took, when you were writing something onto a person that would outlast the feeling that made them want it. I never thought I'd be doing it to an apex predator. But then, I never thought I'd be the last human being standing between 2 species and an incident report that ended with the phrase escalation to full conflict. Here's how it started. Here's how most things that change your life start, with a miscommunication, a body that won't behave, and a door that opens at exactly the wrong moment. Outpost Garen 7 was not a prestigious posting. It sat at the edge of the Caveth Reach, which was the galactic equivalent of that stretch of highway between 2 nowhere towns where the gas stations have bars on the windows, and the locals give you directions using landmarks that burned down in 1987. The Caveth Reach was unclaimed, unpatrolled, and deeply uninteresting to everyone except the species that used it as a migration corridor. There were 3 of those species: the Pelani, who were herbivorous, gentle, and roughly the size of a beluga whale; the Marushan, who were omnivorous, aggressively curious, and kept trying to dismantle our sensor arrays because they thought they were nesting structures; and the Vrath. The Vrath were none of those things. They were predators in the purest sense of the word, not metaphorical apex predators, not culturally dominant species who'd simply outcompeted their neighbors, but honest to God, evolved for violence, sit at the top of the food chain on 3 separate worlds killing machines. 9 feet of articulated exoskeletal armor over dense muscle. Bioluminescent strips running down their spinal ridges that functioned as both threat display and communication. Colors cycling through frequencies our eyes could barely track. A whole language written in light we weren't built to read. 4 upper limbs with independent articulation. 2 primary sensory organs that were not eyes, not ears, nothing with a human analog, but which apparently detected electromagnetic fields with a precision that let them triangulate heartbeats through solid walls. The Vrath could hear you scared, which made the fact that Corporal Jonas Devereaux had, 3 weeks ago, pointed his sidearm at Commander Vrathkel's face from approximately 18 inches and not pulled the trigger, even more remarkable. I wasn't there for it. I was in the medical bay cataloging bioluminescent ink samples when the alert came in, priority red all hands, do not engage. And by the time I got to the corridor junction, the crisis was already technically over. Technically, because Vrathkel had simply stopped. Stopped her advance. Stopped the threat display cycling her dorsal lights through murder-red frequencies. Stopped the entire sequence of violence the encounter logs later described as 83 seconds from initial contact to complete de-escalation, cause unknown. Jonas had stood there with his sidearm out and his hand not quite steady, and the Vrath commander had looked at him, whatever looking meant for a creature with no eyes, and backed down. Not retreated, not withdrawn strategically, backed down. The posture adjustment was unmistakable even to a human xenobiologist who'd spent 7 years studying them on sensor logs. It was the body language of a predator who has assessed something and decided it warrants further observation. That was 3 weeks ago. The diplomatic team filed 600 pages of analysis and arrived at 4 competing theories. I read all of them. None of them were right, because none of them were paying attention to the right detail. I was paying attention to the right detail. I just hadn't said anything yet, because the right detail was sitting in my own personnel file under non-standard deployment equipment, and I wasn't sure how command was going to feel about it. I did talk to Jonas about it, though. 2 days after the incident, when the investigation was still going on, and he was technically on administrative hold pending the outcome. I found him in the rec lounge, which was a generous name for a room with 2 functioning chairs, a table someone had scratched their initials into about 11 different times, and a coffee machine that worked when it felt like it. He was sitting with both hands visible on the table, the way soldiers do when they're processing something, needing to see their own hands, to confirm they're still there and still their own. "Walk me through it," I said, sitting across from him. He looked up. He knew who I was. The outpost had 42 people on it. You knew everyone. "Doc," he said. "Then you mean the incident." "I mean the 83 seconds. He was quiet for a moment. The coffee machine made a sound like it was considering its options. "I heard it before I saw it," he said. "That subsonic frequency they use, the one that gets in your teeth. There was some vrath on station for the quarterly inspection, standard thing. They do it every rotation. We all just stay in our assigned areas and they do their circuit and leave. Except this one didn't leave with the others. I came around the junction at the south end of level 3 and there she was." He paused. Her lights were the red, the one that the manual says means. "Lethal threat assessment in progress," I said. "Yeah." He turned his hands over, looking at the palms. "The manual also says don't draw your weapon and don't run and don't make sudden movements and just wait. See what happens." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'd read that brief probably 16 times. I want you to know that in the moment it was completely useless information." "But you drew." "I drew because she was moving and I don't know, my body made a decision before my brain got involved. And then I had the weapon out and I was looking at her and she stopped completely." He looked at his hands again. "I thought she was winding up to do something, some predator thing where they go still before they hit, so I kept the weapon up. And she just stayed still, and her lights changed." "Changed to what?" "The gold one, the amber thing. The one they use when they're not actively trying to kill something." He paused. "Then she looked at my hands." He held them up slightly. "Like specifically at my hands, not at the weapon, at my hands. And she stood there looking at them for probably 20 seconds and then she backed up, and kept backing up, and turned around and walked away." He lowered his hands to the table again. "I stood there for about 30 seconds after she left," he said. "And then I reported it and they put me on admin hold, and I've been sitting in rooms being asked questions by people who keep looking at me like maybe I did something wrong but they can't figure out what." He met my eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said, "I don't think so. I think you accidentally did something very right." I nodded at his hands. "Can I see?" He extended them. The Yoruba patterns ran from mid-knuckle to wrist on both hands, rendered in deep black ink that had a certain solidity to it, the kind of work done by someone who'd been doing it for a long time, with pigment that had sat well in his skin for years. The bioelectric disruption pattern in tissue that old and well settled would be pronounced. Clean, clear, like a signal with no static. I measured them in my mind against what I knew about Vrath's sensory organ range. 18 inches. He'd held them up at roughly chest height, weapon in his right hand, left hand secondary position, both hands forward. 18 inches from a sensory organ that could read the bioelectric signature of ink in nervous tissue. "Jonas," I said, "your grandmother, the one who commissioned these." He looked at me. "Yeah." "Is she still living?" Something shifted in his face, something quieter and more complicated. "She is. She's 93. She's in Lagos. She knows I'm out here, she just doesn't know." He gestured vaguely at the general situation, specifics. "When this is over," I said, "I think you should tell her about this. I think she'd want to know." He studied me for a moment. "You know something," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a theory," I said, "and I'm not quite ready to put it in a report yet, but yes." He nodded slowly. He looked at the coffee machine, which had apparently reached a decision because it began producing something with moderate enthusiasm. He got up to get it. He brought me a cup without asking, which told me things about Jonas Devereaux as a person that I'd carry for a long time. "Whatever your theory is," he said, sitting back down, "I hope it's something we can use." "Me too," I said. The detail was this: Jonas had tattoos. Not just had tattoos, had significant, visible, culturally meaningful tattoos, both hands marked from knuckle to wrist in the traditional Yoruba patterns his grandmother had commissioned when he enlisted, a prayer for safe return written in the oldest ink language his family carried. When he'd raised his hand with the weapon, those marks had been approximately 18 inches from Vrathkel's primary sensory organs. The Vrath could read electromagnetic signatures in organic tissue, including, it turned out, the unique bioelectric disruption pattern that bioluminescent ink created in a human nervous system. I knew this because I'd been studying it for 3 years, in a research program that Command had funded with exactly the enthusiasm you'd expect for xenobiological tattoo artistry as a diplomatic and security tool. Which was very little, until the moment it was suddenly the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. Here is the brief version of how a xenobiologist ends up specializing in the intersection of human tattooing practices and alien electromagnetic biology. You become obsessed with a discovery that everyone else thinks is interesting but not actionable, and you spend a decade following it anyway. The long version starts with my doctoral research, which was on bioelectric communication in non-carbon-based organisms. The way that certain alien species use low-level electromagnetic fields as a primary or secondary communication medium, essentially broadcasting information through the specific patterns of their biological electrical activity. It's the thing that makes the Vrath's bioluminescent strips work. The light is the visible component, but underneath it there's a bioelectric signal layer that carries the actual information content, and the light is partly just the surface effect of the deeper signal, the way that the visible flame of a fire is just the byproduct of the chemical process underneath it. 3 years into my postdoctoral work, I was studying Vrath bioelectric communication patterns from archived sensor data, and I noticed something that made me put down my coffee and sit very still for approximately 4 minutes. The electromagnetic signature that the Vrath generated when one of their own was displaying a record-bearing mark on their hide. The signal produced when a scarred warrior walked into a room, and the other Vrath in that room were reading the damage on her exoskeleton, was structurally similar to the bioelectric disruption pattern produced in human tissue by tattoo ink. Not identical, not even close to identical if you were being precise, and I was being precise, because precision was the only way this was going to be worth anything. The frequencies were different. The tissue types were completely different. The mechanism by which the signal was generated was different. But the structure of it, the way the signal was patterned, the informational architecture underneath the surface variation, rhymed. I wrote this up as a technical paper titled Convergent Bioelectric Communication Structures in Human Dermal Ink Saturation and Vrath Exoskeletal Damage Patterns, a preliminary analysis. I submitted it to the Journal of Xenobiological Sciences. They published it with the note that the hypothesis was intriguing, but the evidence was circumstantial. 16 people read it in the first year, by my citation count. 14 of them were in my specific subfield. One was apparently a journalist who never followed up. One was a defense research contractor who sent me a polite form letter saying that the research didn't align with current procurement priorities. I kept going. Of course I kept going. When you find the thing, you keep going. What I found over the next 4 years of increasingly specific research was this. The Vrath didn't just use their marked hides as record-keeping. The electromagnetic signal generated by the marks was part of how they recognized each other as individuals. Not the only part, they had other sensory channels, but it was significant. A Vrath with no marks on her hide registered to other Vrath sensory organs as something close to a juvenile, a young thing that hadn't yet survived enough to record, a Vrath whose hide was heavily marked registered, as the closest translation was wait, something with weight, something that had been somewhere and come back. When I applied that framework to human tattooing and began running the numbers on what human tattoo ink's bioelectric signature would look like to a Vrath sensory organ, I got results that made me apply for the outpost posting at Garin 7. Command approved the posting and my equipment manifest, because the manifest was labeled Xenobiological Research Tools, and the person who processed it had not read the underlying research. I arrived at Garin 7 with my kit, my scanner, 11 years of theoretical work, and no particular plan for what to do with any of it except be in the right place if the right moment happened. The right moment happened 3 weeks in, on a Wednesday, when Jonas Devereaux raised his marked hands 18 inches from an apex predator's sensory organs, and she stopped cycling the frequency the field guides called lethal threat assessment in progress. Commander Vrathkel came back alone. That was the part nobody had predicted. The Vrath didn't send individual emissaries. They didn't do anything individually. Their social structure was built around dominance hierarchies enforced through collective witness, which meant that a Vrath doing anything significant did it in front of her own people, or it didn't count. A Vrath commander arriving at a human outpost without her unit, without her subcommanders, without even a juvenile escort, was the kind of thing the diplomatic teams models had rated at less than 1% probability. She came on a Wednesday. I remember because we were having a particularly bad mess hall situation involving reconstituted protein and a cook who'd been on the station too long and had developed opinions about spice. I was eating outside on the loading dock, which was against 3 different regulations, and which I did anyway because the loading dock had a view of the Caveth Reach that made you feel like you were sitting inside a painting of everything vast and slow and indifferent. And sometimes you needed that. The sensor alert came through my earpiece. Single contact, Vrath biosignature approaching from the southern corridor. No unit, no weapon readiness indicators. Then 3 seconds later, a second alert. The contact had paused outside the medical bay and appeared to be waiting. I put down my food. I thought about it for about 4 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough not to lose my nerve, and then I walked around the exterior corridor to the medical bay entrance. She was waiting outside it. Up close, the Vrath were something that photographs and sensor logs couldn't prepare you for, not because of the size, though the size was considerable. Not even because of the lights. The bioluminescent strips running her spinal ridges were cycling something slow and amber gold in that moment, which the field guides described as post-conflict neutral state or possibly curiosity in a dominant organism, the researchers never having quite agreed. It was the stillness. A creature built for violence, at absolute rest, radiating the specific quality of attention that belongs to things that have never in their evolutionary history needed to be afraid of anything they were looking at. She was looking at me. I mean, she was orienting her primary sensory organs in my direction, which was the closest translation. And I was doing the thing I'd spent 7 years training myself not to do when facing a Vrath, which was broadcast the electromagnetic signature of fear through my nervous system like a radio tower. I was not doing well at it. "Commander Vrathkel," I said. My voice came out more or less even, which I considered a personal achievement on par with anything else I'd done in my career. "I'm Dr. Nadia Osei. I'm the xenobiological specialist attached to this outpost." I held up both hands, palms out. Standard non-threat posture, which I knew perfectly well the Vrath didn't read the way humans intended it, but which I did anyway because it gave my hands something to do that wasn't shaking. "The medical bay is my workspace. Did you need something?" The amber gold light cycled, slowed. There was a color in there I didn't have a name for, something between green and the specific quality of light you get just before a storm breaks, when the sky turns the color of old brass. She reached out one of her upper limbs. I want to be precise about what that looked like. 9 feet of apex predator, extending one articulated limb in my direction at approximately the speed of something that has decided it is not in a hurry. The limb terminated in 4 digits with the kind of structural integrity that suggested they could go through a pressure door without significant effort. She was pointing at my arm. My left arm specifically, where the compass rose lived, still wobbly after 20 years, still not pointing anywhere in particular. I looked at it, I looked at her. Yeah, I said, that's mine. The lights shifted. Something faster now, cycling through frequencies I couldn't track. Her posture adjusted, not the lethal compression that meant incoming violence, but something else, something the field guides didn't have a category for, which meant I was either witnessing something unprecedented, or I was about to die in a way that would at least make the incident report interesting. You want to come in, I said. Here is what 3 years of funded research and 4 years of unfunded obsession had taught me about the Vrath. They marked their own. Not with ink, with scar tissue, specifically, with damage applied in controlled patterns to their exoskeletal plating. Every Vrath warrior carried a record of her combat history in the damage on her hide, and those patterns weren't random. They were language, a complete accounting, what she'd faced, what she'd survived, what she'd killed, what had been worth killing. The oldest warriors had hides that read like encyclopedias, layer on layer of healed damage, creating a 3-dimensional text that the rest of the Vrath could apparently read as fluently as you'd read a page of print. The Vrath didn't have writing in the human sense. They had skin. What Jonas's tattoos had done, when he raised that marked hand 18 inches from Vrathkel's sensory organs, was read like text. Not text she could fully parse. The bioelectric signature of human tattoo ink in human nervous tissue was a different medium, a different language entirely, but text she could recognize as text. A marked individual with visible record on his body, standing his ground. The Vrath didn't back down from courage. They backed down from something more specific, a marked individual showing marks they couldn't read yet. The curiosity of a predator who has encountered something she doesn't have a category for is not a comfortable thing to be the object of, but it's a survivable one. That was my theory. I'd written it up 6 weeks ago and submitted it to the diplomatic team under the title Bioelectric Tattoo Signature as Unintentional Communication Vector in Vrath Encounters. And it had gone into the pile of speculative xenobiology papers that Command filed under interesting if true, not actionable. And now Commander Vrathkel was sitting in my medical bay, which had chairs designed for humans, and therefore accommodated approximately 40% of her frame, and she was examining my left arm with the focused attention of someone reading something very slowly in a language they're just beginning to understand. I sat across from her. My heart was doing something complicated. I tried to keep it from broadcasting too loudly. You came back, I said, not quite a question. The light on her dorsal ridge cycled something that the field guides categorized as acknowledgement. I'd always found that translation suspiciously convenient. The researchers were probably projecting, but in this moment it looked right. Because of Jonas, I said, Corporal Devereaux, the man with the marked hands. A pause. Then, from somewhere in her thorax, the Vrath had a secondary resonance organ that produced frequencies both inside and outside human hearing range, a sound. Low, almost subsonic. The field guides called it a query vocalization, which was a very clinical way to describe a sound that made the fillings in your back teeth hum. You couldn't read him, I said. You're used to reading what's on your people's hides. You've never seen marks in this medium before. You've never seen a species that carries its record written into soft tissue instead of hard, and you backed down because you couldn't read what he was saying. I watched her lights. And you came back, I said slowly, because you want to know what he was saying. The amber gold slowed to something almost still. Not danger, not the fast cycling that meant aggression or alarm. Something quieter than that. Something that in a human looking at a human I might have called anticipation. I had spent my entire adult career working toward a moment I was never entirely sure would come. 7 years of research, 4 years before that of obsessive study, 11 years total of believing that the thing that would matter between our species and the Vrath was not weapons, not territory, not diplomacy in the conventional sense, but this. The oldest thing. Skin and ink and what you choose to write on yourself, and the fact that every species with enough consciousness to fight has also developed enough consciousness to mark itself, to say, I was here. This happened. I survived it. I got up. I went to my equipment locker. I said, I'm going to show you something. You don't have to hold still, but I think if you hold still, you'll understand. My kit was not standard issue. Standard medical bay equipment didn't include 3 grades of bioluminescent bioink developed over 4 years of xenobiological research, a custom needle array calibrated for variable tissue densities, or a portable electromagnetic resonance scanner that let me watch in real time how ink integrated into nervous tissue at the bioelectric level. Command had let me bring it because the official project classification was Xenobiological Research Tool, and because the person who'd approved the manifest had not read the project summary carefully enough to understand what I was actually proposing to do with it. What I was actually proposing to do with it was find out whether you could tattoo an apex predator. Not a Vrath specifically. I hadn't been cleared for anything that ambitious, and frankly, when I'd written the research proposal, I hadn't entirely believed that the opportunity would present itself in a direct and personal way. I've been thinking more in terms of sensor-logged data, biological samples, if any became available through the standard specimen exchange program. Maybe a controlled study with consenting Pelani volunteers who were interested in the research questions from a purely academic standpoint, and whose tissue types, while not as structurally useful as Vrath exoskeletal material, would give me something concrete to calibrate against. The Pelani had been enthusiastic about participating, actually. They were curious about everything, and they thought the idea of marking yourself with something permanent was fascinating in the specific way that a species without any such tradition finds the traditions of others fascinating, with the slightly unsettling energy of something that cannot imagine doing it themselves, but is endlessly interested in the fact that you do. I'd spent 2 sessions with a Pelani researcher named something unpronounced by human vocal anatomy, who had asked me questions about tattooing for approximately 6 hours straight, and had then, at the end of the session, shyly asked if she could keep one of the ink samples to take back to her home station for analysis. I'd said yes. She'd left looking like she'd received something genuinely precious, which had made me feel good about xenobiology as a vocation for about 2 days, after which I'd gone back to the Vrath data because the Pelani data, while interesting, wasn't what I was really after. The Vrath data was what I was really after, and now here was an opportunity to generate some. I'd been studying the bioelectric properties of various alien tissue types, and working out whether human tattooing techniques could be adapted for non-human biology, and I'd been doing it entirely theoretically, because no alien species with relevant biology had ever held still long enough for the practical component. The Vrath exoskeletal matrix was the specific target because it was the closest structural analog, not close, but closer than anything else in the cataloged xenobiology database, to the human dermal tissue in which standard tattoo ink produced the bioelectric disruption signatures I'd been studying. If it worked in Vrath tissue, it would work in the medium that mattered. And Vrathkel was sitting in my medical bay, holding still. Vrathkel held still. I want to be very careful about how I describe the next 4 hours, because I'm aware that from the outside it probably looked insane. A human xenobiologist with a tattoo kit, sitting next to a 9-foot apex predator who could have removed her head from her shoulders without particularly trying, running a preliminary scan, and then, with the specific calm that I've learned is available to you when you've been preparing for something your whole career, and the moment has finally come, asking her to extend her forearm. She extended her forearm. The exoskeletal plating there was thinner than on her dorsal surface. I'd known that from anatomical models. What the models hadn't conveyed was the texture of it, not smooth, not rough, but layered like compressed growth rings in old wood, each layer a slightly different density. The scanner confirmed what I'd theorized. Beneath the exoskeletal surface, the Vrath had a nervous tissue matrix that conducted bioelectric current at a different frequency than human tissue, but on the same principles. The ink would integrate differently. The resonance signature would be different, but it would read. I picked up the needle. Here's the thing about tattooing that I've never been able to explain satisfactorily to people who don't do it. It's not about the pain. The pain is real, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or has a different relationship to sensation than most people. But the pain isn't the point. The point is the commitment. The point is the moment when the needle breaks the surface, and you are permanently making a choice, saying, with your body, this mattered enough to mark. This will be here after the feeling that made me want it is gone. This will be here after I've forgotten the exact quality of the light on that particular day, after the face I was thinking about has changed or gone, after the version of me who chose this has become someone else. This will be here. The Vrath understood permanence. Their whole civilization was built on it. What they put on their hides, they carried forever, and what was on their hides was all their dead could leave behind. A warrior's record continued in the marks she'd earned while they both lived, so that when you read the hide of an elder Vrath, you were reading the history of everyone she'd carried. I started with a line. Just a line to see how she responded. Clean, deliberate, running along the outer edge of the exoskeletal plating on her forearm. The bioluminescent ink I'd chosen was calibrated to integrate with non-human nervous tissue, designed to resonate at frequencies the Vrath's sensory organs could detect. On a human, you wouldn't be able to see the bioelectric integration happening. On her, I could. The line I drew lit faintly from within as the ink settled, a pale gold that her own bioluminescent strips immediately cycled to match. She looked at it. Whatever she felt in that moment, I won't pretend I know. I'm a xenobiologist, not a telepath, and the Vrath are not a species whose inner states translate cleanly into anything a human can read. But her lights cycled something I'd never seen in the field guides, something that wasn't in any of the cataloged frequencies, and she was very, very still. I kept going. 4 hours. I'm not going to describe every minute of it because 4 hours of detailed tattooing is not interesting unless you're the one in the chair, but I'll tell you this. She held still. She didn't flinch once. She tracked every movement of the needle with her primary sensory organs, and her dorsal light cycled constantly through frequencies I couldn't name, but she held still. An apex predator, in a small room with a human 3 feet from her face, letting the human write something on her body. I wrote what I knew. Not in human symbols. She couldn't read those, and I wasn't writing for her to read immediately. I was writing in the language I understood, the visual grammar of traditional mark-making, the patterns that human cultures across 10,000 years had converged on independently, the way that certain shapes mean danger and certain shapes mean protection, and certain shapes mean this creature has faced something and is still here. I was writing in forms the Vrath couldn't fully read yet, in a medium they'd never encountered, and I was trusting that what I'd theorized was true, that the electromagnetic resonance of the ink in her tissue would carry a meaning that transcended the specific visual language, that she would be able to feel, if not read, what it said. What it said was, I see your marks, I have marks of my own. We are both things that have survived enough to record it. I put the needle down. My hands were steady. They're always steady when it matters, which is one of the things I've learned to trust about myself over the years. I can fall apart completely afterward, and I was probably going to, but in the moment, my hands hold. I sat back and looked at what I'd done. It covered approximately 1/3 of her forearm, running from just below the first elbow joint to the ridge, where the exoskeletal plating thickened at the wrist. The bioluminescent ink I'd used was catching her own dorsal light and resonating back, so that the design seemed to breathe with her, lit from within, cycling faintly through the same frequencies her own markings used. It would integrate more fully over the next 48 hours as the ink bonded with her nervous tissue matrix. Right now it was still settling, still finding its position in the bioelectric map of her body. She was very still. I waited. Her primary sensory organs oriented toward her forearm. The amber gold of her dorsal lights had gone very slow, almost imperceptible cycling, like the slow breathing of something at rest, or something in a state I didn't have a word for. Her secondary resonance organ made a sound too low for my conscious hearing to process, but I felt it in my sternum and my teeth and somewhere behind my eyes. Then she did something I wasn't prepared for. She reached across with her other upper limb, the one I hadn't worked on, and she touched my left arm. Not the marked forearm with the old compass rose, though I thought for a moment that was where she was heading. She touched the inside of my wrist, the pulse point, where a human body broadcasts its rhythm most clearly. The Vrath could detect heartbeats through solid walls. What she was doing with that touch was listening to mine. I let her. I sat there in my medical bay with an apex predator's digit resting on my pulse point, and I tried to breathe slowly, and I let her listen to the rhythm of a human heart that was going faster than I would have liked, but was not going to stop. After a while, she withdrew her limb. Her lights cycled something fast and bright, not the red of threat display, not the amber of neutral attention, something I'd never seen cataloged. Something that cycled through colors in a sequence that felt, in the way that some things feel true before you can explain why, like it might be a name, or a word, or the Vrath equivalent of a sentence that meant I understand. She stood, the full 9 feet of her, in a room designed for humans, filling it so completely that the ceiling sensors adjusted automatically. She oriented her sensory organs toward me one more time. Then she moved to the door. She paused in the doorway, just for a moment. On her forearm, in the dim light of the corridor, the ink I'd put into her was beginning to integrate fully, settling into the bioelectric matrix of her nervous tissue, becoming part of the electromagnetic signature she broadcast to every sensory organ in her species that came within range of her. She would carry it. Every Vrath she encountered from this point forward would detect it as part of her biological record. They would not be able to read what it said, not yet, but they would know it was there. They would know she had let a human write on her. She left. I sat in my medical bay for about 4 minutes doing absolutely nothing, and then I put my head down on my workbench and breathed into the surface of it, and the shaking I'd kept out of my hands for 4 hours finally went somewhere it could express itself, and I let it. I filed the incident report at 300 the next morning. It was the most carefully worded document I'd ever written, and I've written some documents in my career that required significant care. I had to explain that I had tattooed the apex predator species' military commander without prior diplomatic authorization, using equipment that was technically classified as research tools rather than diplomatic instruments, in a one-on-one encounter that I had not reported to command before undertaking, because I had made a judgment call in approximately 4 seconds based on 11 years of research, and the specific quality of the attention in the way she had been looking at my compass rose. I included the full theoretical framework, the scanner data from the ink integration process, the electromagnetic resonance readings, and a detailed account of every observable behavioral shift during the 4 hours. I included my interpretation of the final light cycle and clearly labeled it as interpretation. I included my recommendation, which was that we needed to establish a formal diplomatic channel immediately, and that the channel should involve a xenobiological art exchange, and that I should probably be part of it. I sent it to the diplomatic team, to command, and to my department head, who was going to have opinions about the equipment manifest. Then I went to find Jonas. He was on the loading dock, because Jonas also had a thing about the loading dock view, which was maybe why we'd been friendly since my 2nd week at the posting. He was sitting on the equipment crate I usually used, and he had coffee, 2 cups, because Jonas had been on enough stations with enough colleagues to have developed the habit of always making 2. I heard there was something with a Vrath in the medical bay, he said. There was. You okay? I took the coffee. I sat down next to him on the crate. The Caveth Reach was doing its thing, slow and vast, and entirely unconcerned with the specifics of what happened on the small stations people had stuck into its edge. Out there in the dark somewhere, 312 Vrath warships were on a standard migration circuit, and their commander was going back to them with human ink in her hide. I tattooed her, I said. Jonas looked at me for a moment. You tattooed Vrathkel. She held still. He drank his coffee. He looked at his own hands, the Yoruba patterns across his knuckles, the prayer for safe return his grandmother had commissioned, the marks that had changed everything when he'd held them 18 inches from her sensory organs 3 weeks ago and not pulled the trigger. She held still, he repeated. She came back to find out what you were saying when you held up your hand. He looked at his hands a little longer. What was I saying? I thought about how to answer that. You were saying you had marks. You were saying you'd been somewhere and done things and they were on your body and you weren't hiding them. You were saying, I stopped and tried again. You were saying you were a marked thing. A thing that records itself, and she'd never seen that in a species that wasn't Vrath. He nodded slowly. And what were you saying when you put ink in her? I was saying we see theirs, I said. We see that they carry their records in their hides. We were doing the same thing before we ever met them. Different medium, different marks, same principle. I looked out at the Reach. I was saying we're the kind of things that think what we've survived is worth writing down. Jonas didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at his hands. You think it worked, he said. I think she went back to her fleet with human ink in her nervous tissue, and I think every Vrath sensory organ within detection range of her is going to know it's there, I said. I think in about 48 hours, when the ink finishes integrating and the bioelectric resonance signature stabilizes, every Vrath she's ever been in the same room with is going to be able to read that she let a human mark her. And I think, I stopped. You think what? I think the Vrath are going to have a lot of questions, I said, and I think they're going to come here to ask them, and I think we should be ready with answers. He was quiet for a while. The Reach turned slowly outside, or we turned against it. Out there the distinction got philosophical. You know what my grandmother said when she had those done? He held up his hands, the marks across the knuckles catching the exterior lights. She said, marks are promises, not just to yourself, to everyone who can read them. He lowered his hands. She said, be careful what you promise. I thought about the design I'd put on Vrathkel's forearm, the visual grammar of 10,000 years of human mark-making, the shapes that meant I have faced things and survived, the specific line I'd added at the end, a modification of something I'd seen in the xenobiological files on Vrath elder hides, their equivalent of the old human symbol for what endures beyond the individual. I promised her we were worth reading, I said. That's what I wrote. Jonas looked at me. Are we? I thought about it. 11 years of studying a species that had written its whole civilization on its own skin, and the discovery that we'd been doing the same thing all along in a medium they couldn't parse. And one moment in a corridor where a man raised a marked hand and a predator stopped to consider what was written on it. And 4 hours of a needle and ink and held breath and an apex predator holding still. Yeah, I said, I think so. The first formal contact request came in 37 hours later. Not from Vrathkel herself, from her fleet commander. A title the translation software rendered as something between eldest marked and she who carries most, which I chose to interpret as a good sign. The request was transmitted in standard Vrath electromagnetic pulse code, which our systems had been able to decode for 4 years, and it asked for 2 things: a meeting location, and the specific designation of the individual who had inscribed the new text. The diplomatic team spent 9 hours debating who should go. I spent those 9 hours in my medical bay, going through my equipment and checking the ink calibration and running integration tests on the electromagnetic resonance scanner. I also, at some point in there, ran the needle lightly over the inside of my own left wrist, the pulse point she'd touched, and added something small. Not a design exactly, just a mark, a record of a specific day in a medium that would outlast the feeling of it. When they came to get me, I was ready. The meeting happened on neutral ground, a platform between our outpost and the Vrath fleet's forward position, which the translation software kept calling a reading ground, and which I think it was right about, because what happened there was essentially exactly that: reading. Getting to the platform itself was an experience I'll leave partially to the imagination, because the full account of the diplomatic team's 17 competing protocols for the walk across the pressure corridor, the 4 different arguments about where I should stand in the formation, and the specific discussion about whether I should bring my kit or leave it on station, is not the interesting part of the story, even if it was at the time the part that was consuming the most of my attention. What I'll say is, I brought the kit. I put it over my shoulder like a field bag, and I told the diplomatic lead, Commander Chen, that I thought it was relevant, and she gave me a look that I interpreted as, I cannot believe I let a xenobiologist with a tattoo gun represent humanity in first contact, and said nothing, which I counted as consent. There were 11 Vrath present. Vrathkel was third from the left in the formation, and even from 20 meters away I could see the ink on her forearm. Under the specific quality of light at the platform's edge of the reach, a strange light, out there at the edge of the corridor, where the light sources were the station's exterior floods and the slow, distant scatter of the reach itself and nothing else. The ink was lit from within. The bioelectric integration was complete, the ink living now in the nervous tissue matrix of her hide, broadcasting its resonance signature to every sensory organ in the room. All 11 of them could read it was there. None of them could read what it said, not yet. That was the point, that was the invitation. I watched them as we crossed the platform. 11 Vrath standing in formation with the specific stillness of a species that expresses discipline through absolute non-movement, and every one of them with their primary sensory organs tracking the mark on Vrathkel's forearm, and then tracking our delegation, and then tracking the mark again. The way you'd look at someone and then look at the thing in their hand and back again, trying to understand the relationship between the two. They knew she had let us do this. They knew because she was their commander, and she was carrying a mark that wasn't Vrath pattern and that hadn't been there before the human encounter, and in Vrath culture, which I had spent years studying and was currently understanding better than I'd ever expected to, in real time in the field. That was not a small thing. The marks on a Vrath's hide were the record of her life. What she chose to add to that record, and under what circumstances, was entirely hers. She had chosen to add this. They were all reading what that choice said about the human encounter, and I had no idea what conclusion they were drawing, and I was trying very hard not to broadcast that uncertainty through my electromagnetic signature. The fleet commander was at the center of the formation. I had studied the photographs and the sensor logs. She who carries most, The eldest marked, the translation software had been rendering her title differently in different contexts, which was usually a sign that the title was doing more than one kind of work in the original language. In the photographs she had looked old, in the way that the Vrath read as age, layered. Hides that were smooth were young. Hides that were textured with healed damage, layer on layer, were old. Her hide was so thoroughly textured that, at the scale of the sensor logs, it read as almost uniform, the individual marks lost in the accumulation of them, and it was only when I looked at the high-resolution photographs that I could begin to see the individual shapes and understand that what I was looking at was not uniform at all. It was dense. It was a 400-year library of everything that had happened to her and everything she had done about it. Up close, it was something that photographs still didn't prepare you for. Different from Vrathkel's in kind, not just degree. Vrathkel was in her mid-century by Vrath reckoning, still young enough that the marks on her hide had spaces between them, individual events you could isolate and examine. The elder's marks had consumed the spaces. There was no hide left that wasn't marked, and the marks had marked the marks, and the whole surface was a palimpsest of her life, a living document that the Vrath who stood on either side of her were reading in real time with the constant low-level attention of people who understand they are always in the presence of history. She oriented her primary sensory organs toward me. The attention was physical. I don't mean that metaphorically. The electromagnetic fields generated by a Vrath's sensory organs during active assessment are detectable by sensitive instruments, and, it turns out, are marginally detectable to human nervous tissue without any instruments at all. A low-level sensation, somewhat like the feeling before a static shock, or the quality of air pressure that changes before a very close lightning strike. Full active assessment from an elder Vrath at close range felt like that. My entire body told me that something significant was paying very significant attention. And the thing about being a scientist is that you have learned to override the part of your nervous system that wants to run from that feeling, but you have not learned to not feel it. I stood my ground. She made a sound. The translation software produced, the one who inscribed. Yes, I said. My voice came out steady. Jonas was behind me and to my right, and I could feel his steadiness there the way you can feel a warm surface without touching it, and I borrowed some of it. I'm Dr. Nadia Os. I'm the xenobiologist. I'm the one who put the ink in her. A long pause in which the elder's lights cycled through something complex and slow, and the 10 other Vrath in the formation processed, whatever she was expressing through those lights, with the specific attention of people who are listening carefully to something important. Then you carry marks. She wasn't talking about my clothes. The precision of her sensory organs from this distance meant she was reading the bioelectric signatures of the compass rose on my calf, the various marks I'd accumulated across shoulders and ribs, and the inside of my wrist over 20 years of decision-making. The whole small, unsteady, occasionally drunken history of what I'd decided was worth writing down. Yes, I said. Your commander carries marks. I thought of Jonas behind me, his grandmother's prayer on his knuckles, the mark Vrathkel had put on his wrist, the word for asterisk endures in Vrath pattern language, which he hadn't received yet because that part of the story hadn't happened yet, but would because I was about to make it possible. Yes. The marked one who did not fire. Yes. Another pause. The elder cycled something I thought I recognized, the query vocalization, the almost subsonic frequency that made fillings hum and the air feel pressurized. You mark your own. We do, I said. We have for as long as we've been us, before writing, before cities, before we knew there was anything else out there. We've always had the thing of deciding what was worth recording and writing it on ourselves, in the medium we had. I looked at the dense, layered surface of her hide, the 400-year library. The same medium you use, skin, the thing we're in, the thing we can't take off. We've always thought that was the right place for the record, the most honest place, because it goes everywhere you go and there's no leaving it behind. The elder was still for a long moment. 10 wrath around her still. A quality of silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something being very carefully considered. Then, what did you write on the commander's hide? I had known they were going to ask this. I'd spent 37 hours thinking about how to answer it. I'd written 17 drafts of an answer and deleted all of them, because the diplomatic language felt wrong, and the scientific language felt wrong, and the personal language felt closest but still not right. And in the end, I decided to just say the thing. I wrote that she was worth reading, I said, and that we were worth being read by. The light cycled, I kept going. In our language, in the visual grammar of what we write on ourselves, what I put on her forearm says that we have marks, that we are the kind of thing that records what it survived, that we see the marks on her people and we recognize them because we've been doing the same thing all along and we want to know what the marks say. I stopped. Then carefully, and that we are asking, not telling. We want to read each other. We're not claiming we can do it yet. We're saying we want to try. The elder was very still. Then she moved a slow, deliberate movement, the specific slowness of something that is being intentional about the pace. She extended her upper limb toward me, not at me, toward me. The limb turned, presenting the underside of the exoskeletal plating. The thinner section, the place where the nervous tissue matrix was closest to the surface and the electromagnetic signals were clearest, and where the accumulated marks of 400 years were so dense they read to my eye as texture, and to Vrath's sensory organs as a complete accounting of a life. She was offering me space. In the middle of 400 years of record, there was still room. There was always room. You didn't run out of skin to write on until you were finished, and she was not finished. The translation software, catching something in the frequency of her dorsal lights, produced 5 words. 5 words that the xenolinguistics team spent 3 months arguing about the precise translation of, with competing papers published, and a formal debate at the next interspecies symposium that I was invited to, and did not attend because I was in the field doing the actual work. They argued about whether right was the right translation, or whether it was closer to asterisk inscribe or mark or asterisk record. They argued about the implications of the specific syntax in the original electromagnetic pulse encoding. They produced 47 pages of analysis about what the elder had meant. I have always believed I understood it correctly in the moment, gut and training, and 11 years of obsession, and the specific quality of the light at the edge of the caveth reach on the day a predator held still for me. The software said, "Then write on mine also." What followed was not a single day's work. I want to be honest about that, because the story gets told sometimes as if it was a single gesture that changed everything, and single gestures don't change anything by themselves. Single gestures are where things start. What changes things is the work. The work was learning what the Vrath mark said slowly, in collaboration with the elder who was patient with our imprecision in a way I hadn't expected from a species built for dominance. Learning which of our marks they could partially read through electromagnetic resonance and which needed visual translation. Developing a shared grammar, which took 8 months and 3 separate xenolinguistics teams, and a lot of evenings on the loading dock with Jonas, working through the specific qualities of what we were trying to say. The work was tattooing 11 Vrath fleet commanders, one by one, with marks they'd begun to be able to read, and having their own elder, she who carries most, the eldest marked, the one whose hide carried 400 years of Vrath history in its layers, extend her limb in return and mark Vrath patterns on the forearms of every human who asked, using a modified instrument she developed herself in the first month of contact. The work was a diplomatic exchange that the broader human Vrath engagement team later called the most effective first contact protocol in documented interspecies relations, and which I called 11 years of being told your research wasn't actionable. The work was Jonah's. On the day the first formal alliance document was signed, sitting in the medical bay and getting the Vrath pattern for asterisk indoors added to the inside of his wrist, in ink calibrated by Vrathkel herself, who had by then learned enough about human tattooing to do the honors. She was not quick, and she was not precise by human standards, and Jonah's held still through the whole thing with the particular quality of stillness I recognized from the other chair. Afterward, he looked at it for a long time. "My grandmother was right," he said. "About the promises," I said. "About marks." He turned his wrist. The Vrath pattern caught the light and resonated faintly. The bioluminescent calibration Vrathkel had used meant it would, ever so slightly, be detectable to Vrath's sensory organs within a few feet of him. He'd always be broadcasting something to them. "She said marks are how you tell the world what you're still carrying," he said. "Even when you don't have words for it, even when the people who should know aren't listening. You write it on yourself and you carry it, and eventually someone learns to read." I thought about Vrathkel, pausing in my doorway with human ink lighting her forearm in the corridor dark. I thought about the elder's limb, extended toward me on the reading ground, the 5 words the software had pulled from the electromagnetic pulse of her lights. I thought about the specific feel of a needle finding the nervous tissue of a species no human had ever touched before, and the moment when the ink settled and she didn't flinch, and her lights went somewhere the field guides hadn't cataloged. "Someone always learns to read," I said. "I've been asked to write this up officially, which is why it exists as a document at all. There are 6 separate formal reports already, and the academic papers are starting to come in from people who weren't there, and I have feelings about that which I'm choosing to keep mostly to myself. What I'm writing here is the other version. The one that stays with me when I'm not being asked to produce source citations. This is what I remember, a loading dock and a view that made you feel small in a useful way, a compass rose that never pointed anywhere, a man who raised a marked hand and didn't pull the trigger, a door that opened at exactly the right moment or exactly the wrong one, depending on how you're calculating risk. A 9-foot predator holding still. I've done a lot of tattooing in my life. I've never once walked away from a session feeling like I'd done nothing, because that's not what tattooing is. It's a commitment, a record, a mark that says this mattered enough to write down. Every mark I've ever made has been in service of that principle. Every mark I've ever carried has been the same. What I wrote on Vrathkel's forearm was the truth. We are things that mark ourselves. We have always done it. Before writing, before cities, before we lifted our eyes to the sky and started wondering who else was out there, we were putting marks on our own skin and saying, "I was here. This happened. I survived it." It turns out the apex predator does exactly the same thing. It turns out that when you show something what you carry, and you don't flinch, and you offer to read them in return, sometimes they hold still. The compass rose on my left calf still doesn't point anywhere in particular. I've stopped minding. Direction was never really the point. The point was the commitment. The point was writing something on yourself that said, "This is what I'm carrying. This is what I'm choosing to carry. Read me if you can." An apex predator backed down, and then came back alone, and held still for 4 hours while I wrote on her hide. I am never going to be done finding that remarkable. Neither, I think, is she.